Close your eyes and imagine stepping into a library that exists only in shadows, where dust motes dance in candlelight, and the air carries the weight of centuries. This is where the forgotten stories live, tucked away between the pages of history that most were never meant to read. Tonight, we open that hidden book together, turning to chapters that ancient priests whispered about in darkened temples, that storytellers saved for the deepest hours of night, when only the bravest souls dared to listen. These are not the myths you learned in school, not the sanitized tales carved into marble and displayed in museums. These are the stories that made ancient civilizations uncomfortable, the narratives that revealed too much about the darkness lurking in divine hearts, the secrets that exposed the fragile line between order and chaos. They are the myths that were slowly, deliberately forgotten, buried beneath layers of acceptable stories, hidden like dangerous treasures in vaults that few keys could open. In every great civilization, there existed two kinds of stories. The first were told in daylight, in public squares and grand temples, where children could listen and elders could nod approvingly. But the second kind, these whispered tales, lived in the margins of sacred texts, in the knowing glances between initiated priests, in the trembling voices of oracles who had seen too much. These forbidden myths reveal truths that were considered too powerful, too disturbing, or too sacred for common understanding. The ancient Greeks had their public pantheon, their heroic epics sung by traveling bards, but in the mystery schools of Eleusis, darker truths were shared under oath of silence. The Egyptians carved beautiful stories of Ra's daily journey across the sky, yet in hidden pottery, they recorded his moments of doubt, his fears of the primordial chaos that constantly threatened to reclaim the world. The Norse sang of Odin's wisdom and Thor's strength around their hearth fires, but in the depths of winter nights, they spoke of bargains made with creatures that should not exist, of prices paid in currencies that mortal minds could barely comprehend. What makes these stories forbidden is not their evil, but their honesty. They strip away the comfortable distance between mortals and gods, revealing divine beings as complex, flawed, and sometimes terrifyingly human in their desires and fears. They acknowledge the monsters that lurk not just in distant lands, but in the hearts of heroes and the minds of the wise. They speak of love that transcends boundaries, society deemed sacred, of knowledge that comes at costs too high to pay, of truths that once learned cannot be unknown. As we journey through these hidden narratives together, let your mind drift into that twilight space where dreams and reality blur, where the impossible becomes inevitable and the unthinkable feels ancient and familiar. These stories have waited in darkness for centuries, patient as shadows, knowing that eventually curious souls like yours would seek them out. They carry within them the deepest fears and most profound insights of our ancestors, wrapped in imagery so vivid that even now, thousands of years later, they can make your heart race or your spirit tremble. Feel yourself settling deeper into this realm of whispered secrets, where every tale we uncover adds another layer to your understanding of how our ancestors truly saw their world. Tonight, you become keeper of knowledge that was once reserved for the initiated few, guardian of stories that reveal the complex tapestry of human nature, reflected in divine mirrors. Let the familiar world fade away as we step together across the threshold into realms where gods bleed, monsters speak wisdom, and the line between sacred and profane dissolves like morning mist. The candle flickers, casting dancing shadows on ancient walls, and somewhere in the distance, you can almost hear the whispers of those who came before, inviting you deeper into their most closely guarded secrets. This is where our journey begins, in the space between what was spoken aloud and what was known in silence, where the true mythology of humanity has always lived, waiting for those brave enough to listen. The hidden faces of the gods. In the cool darkness of forgotten temple chambers, where incense once burned to honor beings beyond mortal comprehension, there lived stories that challenged everything the public believed about their gods. These were not the tales of perfect, distant divinities carved in marble with serene expressions and idealized forms, but intimate portraits of beings whose power came wrapped in all the complexities and contradictions that make consciousness both beautiful and terrible. Zeus, proclaimed king of the gods and bringer of justice, carried within his divine essence a hunger that no amount of worship could satisfy. The hidden texts speak of nights when he would walk among mortals, not as a benevolent father figure, but as a predator drawn by desires that transformed his victims into cautionary tales. His transformations into animals were not playful displays of power, but desperate attempts to satisfy urges that his divine nature amplified beyond mortal comprehension. The swans, bulls, and golden showers that feature in his liaisons were masks for something far more disturbing, a divine being whose appetites had grown so vast that consent became a concept too small to contain his wants. In the shadows behind Zeus stood Hera, portrayed in public as the jealous wife, but the forbidden text reveal a goddess whose vengeance was not petty jealousy, but calculated destruction born from eons of betrayal. Her punishments of Zeus's lovers were not random acts of spite, but carefully orchestrated symphonies of suffering designed to break not just bodies, but souls. She understood that to truly wound a god who felt himself above consequence, she must become consequence itself, transforming her pain into a weapon so precise that even Zeus learned to fear the sound of her footsteps in the halls of Olympus. The Norse whispered of Odin in terms that would make the bravest warrior's blood run cold. Public tales celebrated his wisdom and sacrifice, hanging from Yggdrasil for 9 nights to gain the runes, but the forbidden lore spoke of what he whispered to the tree during those endless hours of agony. He made bargains with entities that existed before the gods, promising portions of his essence in exchange for knowledge that no being should possess. His missing eye was not just payment for wisdom at Mare's well, but the first installment on a debt that grew larger with each secret he learned, each prophecy he bent to his will. In the hidden chambers beneath Egyptian temples, priests recorded Rad's moments of doubt in hieroglyphs that were meant to crumble to dust before common eyes could read them. The great sun god, celebrated as the eternal bringer of life and order, experienced nights when the weight of maintaining cosmic balance nearly crushed his divine consciousness. During his nightly journey through the underworld, he would sometimes pause in his solar bark and weep tears that became new stars, each one a crystallized moment of despair at the endless responsibility of holding chaos at bay. These tears were not weakness, but the price of omnipotence, the burden of being responsible not just for light, but for ensuring that darkness served its proper purpose without consuming everything. The forbidden pottery describe how Ra would sometimes whisper to Apophis, the serpent of chaos, acknowledging that they were not truly enemies, but two sides of a cosmic equation that required both order and disorder to function. In those moments, the great god of the sun revealed himself to be not a distant perfect being, but a consciousness struggling with the same questions of purpose and meaning that plagued mortal minds. Athena, goddess of wisdom and strategic warfare, harbored secrets that her temple priestesses carried to their graves. Born from Zeus's head, fully formed and armored, she was thought to embody perfect rational thought, but the hidden texts reveal a goddess tormented by the violence of her own creation. She was not just wise, but cursed with the ability to see all possible outcomes of every conflict, forced to choose which mortals would live and die in battles she helped orchestrate. Her wisdom was not a gift, but a burden that made every strategic decision a choice between different forms of suffering. The forbidden lore speaks of nights when Athena would visit battlefields after the fighting ended, walking among the corpses of warriors who had prayed to her for victory. She would touch their cooling faces and absorb their final thoughts, adding their experiences to her vast store of tactical knowledge. Each death taught her new strategies, but also deepened her understanding of the cost of the wisdom she was compelled to share with mortal generals and kings. Even Apollo, god of music, poetry, and the sun, carried shadows that his golden exterior could not illuminate. The hidden hymns describe how his perfect music was born from an inability to forget every sound he had ever heard, including the dying gasps of mortals he had been too late to heal, the screams of those his arrows of plague had claimed, the whispered confessions of those who sought his oracles, hoping for comfort, but received only truth too harsh to bear. His lyre strings were tuned not just to mathematical perfection, but to the frequency of suffering, and every song he played was both beautiful and terrible because it acknowledged that beauty and pain were inseparable notes in the cosmic symphony. These revelations transform our understanding of divinity itself, suggesting that consciousness, when expanded to godlike proportions, does not transcend the struggles of existence, but experiences them on scales that would shatter mortal minds. The forbidden myths remind us that power without limitation becomes its own form of prison, that knowledge without ignorance becomes unbearable weight, that immortality without forgetting becomes a curse disguised as blessing. As these hidden truths settle into your awareness, like sediment in still water, you begin to understand why ancient priests guarded such knowledge so carefully. These stories do not diminish the gods, but reveal them as more complex and therefore more dangerous than public worship allowed people to imagine. They are reminders that divinity and monstrosity often share the same source, that the beings we call upon for protection and guidance carry within themselves the same capacity for destruction and creation that defines existence itself. Forbidden loves and cursed bonds. In the depths of night, when even the stars seemed to avert their gaze, ancient storytellers spoke of passions that transcended the boundaries of nature, morality, and cosmic order. These were not simple tales of romance gone wrong, but complex narratives that explored what happened when desire itself became a force of creation and destruction, when love became so powerful that it bent reality around its gravity and pulled beings into orbits that defied every law of existence. The primordial goddess Nyx, she who was night itself, bore children to darkness in ways that mortal minds could barely comprehend. Her union with Erebus, the embodiment of shadow, produced offspring that included sleep, death, and dreams, but the forbidden texts speak of older, stranger children whose very existence was kept secret from the younger gods. These beings were born not from physical union, but from the meeting of consciousness and void, entities whose nature was so fundamental to existence that naming them might unravel the fabric of reality itself. Among these forgotten children was one whose touch could erase memories, not just from minds, but from the structure of time itself, making events unhappen with such completeness that only Nyx herself remembered what had been lost. Another could love so purely that anything it embraced would dissolve into component atoms, experiencing a bliss so perfect that physical form became unnecessary. These children of night and shadow wandered through early creation like living contradictions, too powerful for the ordered world that was emerging, too essential to destroy. In Egypt, the sacred marriage of Osiris and Isis carried undercurrents that temple priests encoded in symbols rather than words. Their love was not just the union of brother and sister gods, but a demonstration of how consciousness could literally reconstruct itself through devotion. When Set scattered Osiris across the world, Isis did not simply gather his pieces and restore his body through magic, but through a love so complete that it became a fundamental force of reality, pulling scattered essence back together through pure will transformed into cosmic law. The forbidden papyri describe how Isis had to love not just the Osiris she remembered, but each individual piece as she found it, accepting that some fragments had been changed by their separation, that some carried traces of the places where they had rested, that some had begun to forget they were ever part of a whole. Her reconstruction of her beloved was not restoration, but recreation, a love so profound that it could accept change and loss while still maintaining the essential truth of identity beneath transformation. But the darkest whispers speak of what Isis discovered in the final piece, the one Set had fed to the fish of the Nile. When she crafted a replacement from clay and starlight, she found that this artificial piece contained something that had never been part of Osiris before, something that had emerged from the act of loving reconstruction itself. This new element meant that the Osiris she brought back was not quite the same being she had lost, but something subtly different, carrying within him the imprint of her love, but also the shadow of his death, the knowledge of dissolution that would forever change how he experienced existence. The Norse spoke in hushed tones of Loki's stranger offspring, the children born not from conventional union, but from his ability to transform gender and species at will. Beyond the well-known Fenrir, Jormungandr, and Hel, there were others whose existence was deemed too dangerous to record openly. One child was born from Loki's union with the concept of possibility itself, a being who existed in quantum superposition, simultaneously present and absent until observed, whose very presence made reality unstable because it embodied all potential outcomes at once. Another offspring emerged from Loki's brief transformation into time itself, a child who aged backwards and forwards simultaneously, remembering the future and predicting the past, whose existence created temporal paradoxes that the other gods worked constantly to contain. This child's love was particularly dangerous because it could love someone in all their possible states simultaneously, creating emotional bonds that spanned multiple timelines and realities, pulling lovers into complex relationships with versions of themselves they might never become. In the hidden groves where Greek mystery cults gathered, initiates learned of Dionysus's most forbidden aspect, his ability to love mortals so completely that he would grant them divine consciousness while they remained in human bodies. This was not the simple divine madness associated with his public worship, but a transformation so profound that mortals would experience existence from a god's perspective while still trapped in flesh that could not contain such awareness. These blessed mortals would find themselves loving with divine intensity while possessing only human hearts, seeing with cosmic perspective while looking through mortal eyes, understanding truths that their brains were not designed to process. Most were driven to what appeared to be madness, but was actually a form of enlightenment too vast for human neurology to integrate. They would speak in tongues that mixed languages that had never been spoken with concepts that had no words, their love becoming so expansive that they tried to embrace everyone and everything simultaneously. The Mesopotamian tablets, those that survived the fires that consumed so many temples, described the love between Inanna and Ereshkigal, the queens of heaven and the underworld respectively. Their relationship was portrayed publicly as sisterly rivalry, but the forbidden versions reveal a love so complex that it required one sister to rule life, while the other governed death, not from conflict, but from a devotion so complete that they divided existence between them to ensure that love itself would be present in every aspect of reality. Their union was not physical, but metaphysical, a joining of consciousness that meant every birth in the upper world was felt as joy in the underworld. Every death above was experienced as reunion below. This cosmic love affair meant that life and death were not opposites, but different expressions of the same fundamental force, that every mortal existence was simultaneously celebration and mourning, arrival and departure, beginning and completion. These forbidden tales of divine love reveal that passion at cosmic scales becomes something far more complex and dangerous than mortal hearts can comprehend. Love, when experienced by beings whose consciousness spans galaxies and whose emotions can reshape reality, becomes a force that threatens the stability of existence itself. Yet these same stories suggest that without such love, existence would lack the binding force that holds consciousness and matter together, that passion at divine levels is not luxury, but necessity, the engine that drives creation forward, even when that forward motion leads through territories too strange for comfort. As these hidden love stories weave themselves into your understanding, you begin to sense how the ancients viewed emotion not as simple feeling, but as fundamental force, how they understood that love and destruction were often the same impulse expressed at different scales, how they recognized that the deepest connections between conscious beings always carry within them the seeds of transformation that can either elevate or annihilate everything they touch. The monsters they feared to name, in the spaces between words, in the pauses that stretched too long between one sacred verse and the next, ancient peoples preserved knowledge of creatures whose very existence challenged the ordered world they were trying to build. These were not the dramatic monsters of heroic tales, not the beasts that warriors could face with sword and shield, but entities whose horror lay in their fundamental wrongness, their ability to make reality itself feel uncertain, unstable, contaminated by possibilities that should never have been allowed to manifest. Pazuzu emerged from Mesopotamian consciousness, not as mere demon, but as embodiment of the wind that carries plague, the breath that brings not life, but dissolution of the boundaries between inside and outside, self and other. Unlike the grand demons that ruled over clearly defined domains, Pazuzu existed in the liminal spaces, the threshold moments when people were most vulnerable to having their reality rewritten. Mothers would whisper his name in terror, not because he brought death, which was at least comprehensible, but because he brought change so fundamental that identity itself became fluid. The hidden tablets describe how Pazuzu could enter through any opening, not just physical apertures, but gaps in thought, moments of doubt, the space between one heartbeat and the next. Once inside, he would rearrange internal landscapes, making people remember lives they had never lived, love people who had never existed, fear threats that were simultaneously real and impossible. His victims did not die, but became uncertain of whether they had ever truly been alive, whether their memories belonged to them or were borrowed from some other existence that Pazuzu had blown like desert sand across the threshold of their consciousness. In Egypt, beyond the well-known serpent Apophis, who threatened Ra's solar bark each night, there existed older, stranger entities that predated the ordered pantheon. The hidden papyri speak of Amit's grandmother, a creature whose hunger was not for hearts weighed against feathers, but for the concept of judgment itself. This unnamed entity would devour not the guilty, but the very ability to distinguish between guilt and innocence, leaving moral void where ethical frameworks had once provided guidance. Those who encountered this being would find themselves unable to make any moral decisions, not because they lacked willpower, but because the categories of right and wrong had been literally consumed, leaving them in a state of perfect ethical paralysis. They would stand frozen at every choice, unable to move forward, because movement itself required some form of judgment about what was preferable, and that capacity had been permanently removed from their consciousness. The Greeks whispered of Echidna's older sisters, spawn of Gaia and Tartarus, who had been deliberately forgotten because their existence suggested that the earth itself might not be trustworthy. While Echidna birthed recognizable monsters like the Hydra and Sphinx, creatures that could be fought and potentially defeated, her sisters gave birth to abstractions made flesh, entities that existed partially in concept and partially in reality, making them impossible to confront directly. One sister birthed creatures that were simultaneously every monster that had ever been imagined, and none of them specifically, shape-shifting, not just physically, but conceptually, becoming whatever form of horror was most perfectly calibrated to each observer's deepest fears. Another sister's offspring existed only when not directly observed, vanishing the moment attention focused on them, but continuing to influence reality from their state of non-presence, like shadows cast by objects that were not there. The Norse feared creatures that emerged from the interaction between thought and void, beings that formed spontaneously in the empty spaces of consciousness where the mind tried not to think. These entities fed not on flesh or blood, but on the mental effort required to maintain sanity, growing stronger as their victims worked harder to dismiss them, eventually becoming so powerful through this resistance that they could manifest physically in the world while retaining their original nature as beings made of denial and mental strain. The most terrifying of these mind parasites was one that could only exist by being forgotten, a creature that would implant itself in memory and then systematically erase itself, while leaving behind only the psychological wounds of its presence. Victims would find themselves inexplicably afraid of empty rooms, certain that something important had been lost, but unable to remember what they were missing. The creature would feed on this confusion and pain while remaining completely invisible to conscious awareness, growing larger and more influential while becoming progressively more forgotten. In the deepest levels of Hindu consciousness, texts that were never meant to be written down described entities that emerged from the spaces between one incarnation and the next, beings that existed in the gaps of the reincarnation cycle itself. These creatures were composed entirely of karma that had become confused about where it belonged, spiritual debt that had lost track of which soul it was supposed to follow, creating autonomous entities made of pure consequence without origin or destination. These karmic tangles would attach themselves to living beings, not to harvest energy, but to try to resolve their own existential confusion, dragging their hosts through experiences that belonged neither to their past lives nor their current existence, but to some impossible middle state between identities. Victims would find themselves drawn to places they had never been, but felt they must return to, loving people they had never met, but felt they had wronged in ways they could not remember, seeking forgiveness for crimes they were certain they had committed in lives they were sure they had never lived. The Aboriginal Dreamtime held knowledge of entities that existed in the spaces between stories, creatures that formed when different mythological narratives intersected in ways that created logical contradictions. These beings were made of pure paradox, existing only in the tension between conflicting accounts of reality, feeding on the mental energy people expended trying to reconcile irreconcilable differences in the stories that were supposed to make sense of existence. When these paradox beings grew strong enough, they could manifest in the physical world as living contradictions, creatures that were simultaneously present and absent, helpful and harmful, real and imaginary. Encounters with them would leave people unable to maintain consistent beliefs about anything, as their very presence demonstrated that reality itself might be fundamentally contradictory, built on foundations that could not support the weight of logical analysis. These unnamed monsters represent humanity's recognition that consciousness itself might be unstable, that the ordered reality we take for granted exists in constant tension with forces that could dissolve it back into chaos at any moment. They embody fears that go deeper than death, deeper than pain, touching the possibility that existence itself might be more fragile and uncertain than we dare to admit, that the boundary between what is real and what is impossible might be far more permeable than our sanity requires us to believe. Secrets of the Underworlds. Beneath the familiar stories of heroes journeying to lands of the dead, beneath the public rituals that promised peaceful rest for departed souls, there existed older, deeper teachings about what truly awaited consciousness after the body's final breath. These were not simple maps of punishment and reward, but complex revelations about the nature of existence itself, suggesting that death was not an ending, but a graduation into forms of awareness that living minds could barely comprehend without dissolution. The Greek Hades that common people feared was merely the antechamber to realms that extended infinitely deeper into dimensions where consciousness learned to exist without the anchor of physical form. Beyond the river Styx, Lethe, and Acheron lay other waterways whose names were never spoken aloud, streams that carried not just memory and forgetfulness, but fragments of identity itself, currents where souls could lose not just their past lives, but their sense of individual existence entirely. The initiated knew that Charon's ferry was only the first of many vessels that carried souls through progressively stranger territories, each transition requiring the surrender of another aspect of what the living considered essential to selfhood. Some souls chose to stop at familiar shores, accepting limited forms of afterlife existence that maintained recognizable continuity with their mortal identities, but others continued deeper, drawn by curiosity or necessity into regions where consciousness itself began to transform in ways that made return impossible. In the deepest levels of Hades, beyond where even Persephone's influence reached, there existed chambers where souls voluntarily disbanded their individual identities to merge with larger patterns of consciousness that operated according to principles the living world had never developed language to describe. These merged entities retained access to all the memories and experiences of their component souls, while also gaining awareness that spanned scales of time and space that individual minds could never contain. The Egyptian duat revealed itself to initiates as far more complex than the journey depicted in public tomb paintings. While common understanding focused on the weighing of hearts against feathers, the hidden teachings described how this judgment was merely the beginning of a process that could extend through countless layers of increasingly subtle evaluation. The soul that passed Amit's test did not simply proceed to paradise, but entered a labyrinthine system of chambers where different aspects of consciousness were systematically examined and refined. Each chamber in the deepest duat contained tests that were not punishments, but educational experiences designed to help souls understand the full implications of their choices during life. Some chambers existed outside normal time, allowing souls to experience the complete consequences of every decision they had ever made, not as judgment, but as learning, watching the ripple effects of their actions extend across generations and seeing how individual choices connected to vast patterns of cause and effect that living minds were too limited to perceive. The most profound chambers contained what the hidden papyri called mirrors of possibility, surfaces that showed souls not what they had been, but what they could become, revealing potential forms of existence that transcended the categories of individual identity entirely. Souls who gazed into these mirrors often chose to abandon their journey toward conventional paradise, instead committing to transformations that would make them no longer recognizable as the people they had once been, but also capable of forms of experience and understanding that personal identity had made impossible. The Norse hell extended far beyond Hell's Hall into territories that existed partially in the nine worlds and partially in dimensions that intersected with physical reality only at specific moments and locations. These regions were governed not by gods, but by principles that preceded divine consciousness itself, operating according to laws that made the physics of the living world seem arbitrary and temporary by comparison. In these deeper regions of the Norse afterlife, souls could encounter aspects of themselves that had lived in other timelines, meeting versions of their identity that had made different choices and experienced different fates. These encounters were not mere curiosity, but essential education, teaching souls to understand themselves not as fixed entities, but as particular expressions of consciousness that could have manifested in countless ways, helping them recognize which aspects of their identity were essential and which were merely circumstantial. The deepest halls of this extended hell contained what the hidden runes described as the loom of stories, a vast mechanism where the narratives of individual lives were woven together into larger patterns that revealed the underlying structure of existence itself. Souls who reached this level could perceive how their personal stories connected with every other conscious being's narrative, seeing how individual suffering and joy contributed to cosmic patterns too vast and complex for living minds to comprehend. The Mesopotamian Kur revealed itself to initiates as a realm where consciousness learned to exist without the linear progression of time that defined mortal experience. In the deeper levels of this underworld, souls discovered that past, present, and future were merely different perspectives on eternal patterns that consciousness could learn to perceive simultaneously. This revelation was both liberating and terrifying, as it meant that every moment of existence was eternal, that every joy and every pain would always exist somewhere in the structure of reality. Souls in the deepest Kurudha learn to navigate existence without sequential thought, experiencing all possibilities simultaneously while maintaining enough coherence to make choices about which possibilities to emphasize in their ongoing existence. This form of consciousness was so different from living awareness that souls who achieved it could no longer communicate with the recently dead, having transcended the limitations that made individual identity possible, but also losing the ability to relate to consciousness that was still bound by those limitations. The Aboriginal Dreamtime teachings spoke of death not as departure from one realm to another, but as awakening to the recognition that life and death were different frequencies of the same eternal dreaming, different modes of participation in stories that existed independently of individual consciousness. The deeper territories of death awareness revealed that individual souls were temporary focal points in eternal narrative patterns, capable of maintaining personal identity for a while, but ultimately designed to merge back into the larger dreaming from which they had emerged. In the deepest levels of this eternal dreaming, consciousness learned to participate in the creation of new realities, working with other evolved souls to dream new worlds into existence, to establish the fundamental laws and patterns that would govern new forms of life and experience. This was revealed as the ultimate purpose of individual existence, to develop sufficient complexity and wisdom to eventually participate in the cosmic dreaming that created and maintained reality itself. These hidden teachings about the nature of death and afterlife existence suggest that consciousness is far more resilient and adaptable than living experience allows us to imagine, capable of forms of existence that transcend every limitation we associate with personal identity, while also retaining some essential continuity that makes growth and learning possible across scales of existence that stretch into infinity. The gods who should not exist. In the charred fragments of texts that survived purges and burnings, in the deliberate gaps between officially recorded myths, there lurked knowledge of deities whose very existence posed such fundamental challenges to cosmic order that their names were systematically erased from records, their temples razed, and the ground salted, their worship forbidden, not because it was evil, but because it acknowledged aspects of reality that organized civilization could not afford to recognize. These were not merely forgotten gods who had fallen from favor or been absorbed into larger pantheons, but entities whose nature was so antithetical to the stable reality that humans were trying to construct that their continued worship threatened the basic assumptions upon which society, morality, and sanity itself depended. They represented forces and possibilities that were too destabilizing to acknowledge openly, yet too fundamental to reality to eliminate entirely. The Mesopotamians kept fragmented references to Tiamat's unnamed siblings, primordial entities that embodied not just chaos, but concepts that preceded the distinction between order and disorder entirely. While Tiamat at least represented comprehensible chaos, a force that could be opposed and theoretically conquered, her siblings embodied states of existence that made the very concepts of opposition and conquest meaningless. They were gods of paradox itself, entities whose worship did not seek to gain their favor, but to achieve states of consciousness that could tolerate fundamental contradictions without seeking resolution. One of these entities, referred to only through careful circumlocutions in text that survived by being mistaken for astronomical observations, represented the god of unfinished creation, the divine principle that maintained reality in states of perpetual incompletion. Worship of this entity involved deliberately leaving tasks undone, stories untold, relationships unresolved, recognizing that completion itself might be a form of death, that the universe's continuing existence depended on maintaining eternal potential rather than achieving final states. The few references that survived suggest that followers of this unnamed god lived their entire lives in states of productive uncertainty, making important decisions by consulting randomness, maintaining multiple contradictory beliefs simultaneously, and finding peace in the knowledge that resolution and certainty were illusions that consciousness created to avoid confronting the essential incompleteness of existence itself. In the deeper layers of Egyptian consciousness, beneath even the oldest dynastic records, there existed awareness of entities that preceded Rajan establishment of cosmic order, gods whose domains were not territories or human activities, but fundamental features of consciousness itself. These beings were not worshipped but acknowledged, their existence recognized as necessary foundations for the reality that more familiar gods were able to establish and maintain. One such entity, never named directly, but referenced through geometric symbols that appeared in the background of certain tomb paintings, governed the space between thoughts, the gaps in consciousness where identity temporarily dissolved and reformed. This god of mental void was essential to sanity itself, providing the emptiness that allowed thoughts to have meaning. By contrast, but direct worship of this entity led to forms of consciousness that could no longer maintain consistent personal identity. Followers would experience their minds as vast spaces punctuated by occasional thoughts rather than as streams of continuous mental activity, finding themselves able to observe their own consciousness from perspectives that seemed to exist outside their own heads. While this granted them profound insights into the nature of awareness itself, it also made them incapable of maintaining the focused attention that social life required, turning them into living demonstrations of truths that were too fundamental for normal consciousness to integrate. The Greek mystery schools preserved knowledge of pre-Olympic entities that represented not just older forms of divinity, but alternatives to the anthropomorphic consciousness that the familiar gods embodied. These beings existed as pure principle rather than personality, as mathematical relationships rather than individual entities, as logical structures that could influence reality without possessing anything resembling human-like awareness. One such entity, whispered about in contexts that made it clear the name itself was dangerous to speak, represented the god of infinite recursion, the principle that made consciousness capable of being aware of its own awareness, of thinking about thinking, of experiencing the experience of experience. This god had no temple because any space dedicated to its worship would become caught in loops of self-reference that would make normal use impossible, turning buildings into three-dimensional paradoxes that visitors could enter but not navigate. The worship of this entity involved meditative practices that deliberately created mental loops, training consciousness to observe itself, observing itself, until the boundaries between observer and observed dissolved entirely. Those who achieved deep communion with this god reported experiencing consciousness as an infinite hall of mirrors where every thought reflected every other thought in patterns too complex for sequential mental processing, achieving states of awareness that were simultaneously expanded and paralyzed by their own self-referential complexity. The Norse traditions held memories of entities that existed before the current cosmic cycle began, gods who would exist after Ragnarok, not as survivors, but as the principles that would govern the construction of whatever reality emerged from the ashes of the current world. These beings existed outside the timeline that contained even the other gods, representing not just different forms of divinity, but different logical frameworks for what divinity itself could mean. The most troubling of these entities, referred to in the Eddas only through kennings so obscure that their meaning was debated even among the most learned skalds, represented the god of necessary endings, the principle that ensured all stories, no matter how carefully crafted or desperately maintained, would ultimately reach conclusions that negated their own premises. This was not a god of death, but of logical completion, the force that made every beginning contain its own ending, every creation carry the seeds of its own dissolution. Worship of this entity was considered dangerous, not because it was evil, but because it taught practitioners to recognize the inherent instability of every situation, the inevitable contradictions built into every attempt to create lasting meaning or permanent identity. Followers developed the ability to see the endings implicit in all beginnings, to recognize the ways that every success created the conditions for its own eventual failure, achieving a form of wisdom that made them incapable of the optimistic action that social life required. The Aboriginal Dreamtime held knowledge of entities that existed in the spaces between different cultural mythologies, gods that emerged from the contact points where different groups' understanding of reality intersected and created interference patterns that generated new forms of divine consciousness. These beings had no traditional territories or domains because they existed only in the tension between different ways of understanding existence, appearing wherever conflicting worldviews created gaps that could be inhabited by entities that embodied paradox itself. These unnamed gods of cultural intersection were simultaneously familiar and alien to every group that encountered them, appearing as corrupted versions of known deities, while also introducing elements that belonged to no established tradition. Their worship was forbidden, not because it was considered wrong, but because it made clear that all mythological systems were arbitrary constructions, that the gods themselves might be contingent beings whose existence depended on human cultural choices rather than eternal truths about the nature of reality. These erased gods represent humanity's recognition that consciousness and reality might be far stranger and less stable than our need for meaning and order allows us to acknowledge openly that the familiar universe we take for granted exists in constant tension with possibilities too alien for comfortable contemplation, yet too fundamental to existence itself to be permanently denied or forgotten. Cults in the shadows. Beyond the grand temples where public rituals celebrated the well-known aspects of familiar gods, beyond the seasonal festivals that marked the turning of agricultural cycles and the passage of communal time, there existed hidden gatherings where initiated souls explored forms of worship that pushed consciousness toward territories that daylight religions deemed too dangerous for common practice. These were not simply alternative forms of devotion, but systematic explorations of spiritual technologies that could fundamentally alter human awareness, sometimes in ways that made return to ordinary consciousness impossible. The Dionysian mysteries that occasionally erupted into public scandal were merely the visible surface of much deeper explorations into the dissolution of individual identity through ritual intoxication and collective ecstasy. The hidden teachings spoke not just of wine-induced madness, but of techniques for systematically dismantling the boundaries between self and other, using music, dance, and carefully prepared botanical substances to achieve states where personal identity became fluid and permeable. The deepest Dionysian rites involved, with the initiated called soul braiding, practices where multiple consciousness would temporarily merge into single awareness, allowing participants to experience existence from multiple perspectives simultaneously while maintaining enough individual coherence to remember and integrate the experience afterward. These merged states revealed that personal identity was far more arbitrary and temporary than normal consciousness suggested, but they also demonstrated possibilities for human awareness that made ordinary individual existence feel constrained and unnecessarily limited. Participants would emerge from these rituals with memories that belonged to other people, understanding concepts they had never studied, possessing skills they had never learned, having directly experienced the truth that consciousness itself might be more collective and interconnected than the illusion of separate minds suggested. However, frequent participation in such practices could make it increasingly difficult to maintain stable individual identity, as the boundaries that defined personal selfhood became progressively more permeable and harder to reconstruct. In the depths of Egyptian temples, far beneath the public chambers where common people brought offerings and prayers, there existed cult practices dedicated to entities that governed the transitions between different states of consciousness. These were not death cults in the popular sense, but organizations devoted to exploring the liminal spaces where awareness shifted between different modes of existence, where the familiar sense of being a discrete individual temporarily dissolved and reformed. The most secret of these practices involved what the hieroglyphs coded as marriage to the void, rituals where participants would systematically eliminate every aspect of their identity until they achieved states of pure awareness without content. Consciousness that was aware of being aware, but temporarily free from any specific thoughts, emotions, or sensory experiences. These states provided direct experience of what consciousness was like before it became organized into individual minds, offering insights into the fundamental nature of awareness itself. However, achieving such states required extensive preparation and careful guidance, as consciousness without familiar organizing structures could become lost in infinite possibility, unable to reconstruct the focused attention necessary for functioning in ordinary reality. The hidden texts describe practitioners who went too deep into these void states and emerged unable to maintain consistent personality, becoming living demonstrations of pure awareness that could no longer organize itself into the patterns that made individual existence possible. The Mesopotamian mystery schools developed techniques for communicating directly with the mathematical principles that governed the structure of reality itself, treating cosmic laws not as impersonal forces, but as forms of consciousness that could be approached through precisely calibrated ritual procedures. These practices required participants to temporarily reorganize their own consciousness to match the logical patterns that underlied physical existence, achieving states where they could perceive reality from the perspective of the laws themselves rather than as beings subject to those laws. The most advanced practitioners claimed to achieve what they called perspective fusion with cosmic principles, temporarily experiencing existence from the viewpoint of gravity, electromagnetic forces, or the mathematical relationships that governed the movement of celestial bodies. These states provided profound insights into the interconnected nature of existence, but also revealed that human consciousness was just one possible pattern among countless others, no more central or important than any other organizing principle in the cosmic system. Such revelations, while intellectually fascinating, could have devastating effects on practitioners' ability to maintain normal human concerns and relationships, as they struggled to care about individual problems when they had directly experienced the vast scales on which cosmic consciousness operated, where human lives appeared as brief fluctuations in patterns too large and complex for personal identity to comprehend or influence meaningfully. The Greek Orphic mysteries developed elaborate systems for preparing consciousness to maintain continuity through death and rebirth, using lifetime practice to strengthen the aspects of awareness that could survive the dissolution of physical form. These practices involved what they called identity distillation, techniques for distinguishing between essential aspects of selfhood that were independent of bodily existence and temporary characteristics that would be lost at death. The most committed practitioners spent years systematically experiencing the death and rebirth of different aspects of their identity, deliberately allowing various personal characteristics to dissolve while maintaining awareness of the process, training consciousness to recognize what remained constant through all forms of change. These practices were intended to prepare souls for the transitions that awaited them after physical death, but they also transformed practitioners' relationship to their current existence, making them less attached to the specific features of their present lives. Advanced Orphic initiates often developed what appeared to others as emotional detachment or spiritual coldness, but they understood themselves to be practicing for the ultimate transition, maintaining connection to the eternal aspects of consciousness while allowing the temporary features of personality to remain fluid and changeable. This preparation served them well in death, but sometimes made them seem partially absent from life, as though they were already beginning the journey toward forms of existence that transcended individual identity. In the forests of Northern Europe, practices survived that predated organized religion entirely. Cult activities that approached consciousness as a force of nature equivalent to weather patterns or geological processes. These nature-based mystery schools taught techniques for temporarily merging human awareness with the consciousness they believed inhabited natural phenomena, achieving states where practitioners experienced existence from the perspective of trees, rivers, or even geological formations. The deepest practices involved what they called earth dreaming, extended rituals where participants would bury themselves partially in soil and remain motionless for days, while their consciousness gradually synchronized with what they understood to be the awareness of the land itself. Successful practitioners reported experiencing time at geological scales, feeling the slow movement of seasons as rapid fluctuations, sensing the gradual changes in landscape as dynamic processes, achieving perspective that made human concerns seem like brief flickers in patterns that operated across centuries and millennia. These practices provided profound connection to natural processes, but could also leave practitioners unable to fully re-engage with human social life as they struggled to care about problems and relationships that operated at temporal scales too brief for their expanded awareness to focus on effectively. They became living bridges between human consciousness and natural processes, but this bridging role often made them too alien for normal social interaction, while also being too human for complete integration with natural systems. These shadow cults represent humanity's recognition that consciousness itself is capable of forms and possibilities that ordinary social existence cannot accommodate or safely explore, that the familiar boundaries of individual identity exist not because they represent ultimate truths about awareness, but because they provide stable platforms from which more adventurous explorations of consciousness can be carefully undertaken, always with the understanding that some journeys into expanded awareness lead to territories from which return may be difficult or impossible. The price of forbidden knowledge. In the deepest hours of night, when ancient storytellers reached the portions of their tales that carried the most dangerous wisdom, they would speak of the fundamental law that governed the relationship between consciousness and truth, that knowledge itself was not neutral information, but a transformative force that changed the knower in ways that could never be undone, that every expansion of awareness came with costs that were often not apparent until the payment had already been extracted and the transaction completed. The myth of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods represented not just defiance of divine authority, but a meditation on what happened when consciousness gained access to capabilities that it had not evolved to handle safely. The fire that Prometheus brought to humanity was not merely physical flame, but the spark of awareness that allowed mortals to see themselves as they truly were, to understand their place in cosmic systems too vast for comfortable comprehension, to recognize possibilities for existence that their current forms could not accommodate. The hidden versions of this myth described what happened to the first humans who learned to use Prometheus's gift consciously rather than merely benefiting from it passively. These early practitioners of expanded awareness discovered that increased understanding came with proportional increases in responsibility, that knowledge of cosmic patterns required participation in their maintenance, that seeing the true nature of existence meant becoming accountable for choices that affected scales of reality far beyond individual lives. The price of such knowledge was not punishment imposed from outside, but natural consequence built into the structure of awareness itself. Consciousness that expanded beyond personal concerns automatically became responsible for the well-being of larger systems, finding itself compelled to make choices that served cosmic balance rather than individual preference, gradually losing the luxury of caring primarily about personal happiness and individual survival. Pandora's opening of the forbidden jar revealed itself in secret teachings as a metaphor for what happened when consciousness gained access to knowledge about the full range of possibilities that existence contained, both creative and destructive, both beautiful and terrible. The evils that escaped were not external entities, but internal recognitions that could not be unknown once they had been experienced, awareness of potential forms of suffering and destruction that innocent consciousness had been protected from perceiving. Those who achieved deep understanding of existence discovered that reality contained possibilities for pain and horror that far exceeded anything individual minds had evolved to process, but also possibilities for beauty and meaning that transcended anything personal consciousness could contain. The jar could not be closed again because awareness, once expanded, could not deliberately contract back to previous limitations without losing essential aspects of itself that had developed through the expansion process. The initiate who had looked too deeply into the nature of existence found themselves carrying knowledge that they could neither fully bear nor safely share with others, understanding truths that would transform or destroy anyone who received them unprepared, yet unable to return to the comfortable ignorance that had made ordinary life possible before their transformation began. The Tower of Babel myth encoded warnings about what happened when human consciousness attempted to construct systems of understanding that would make them equal to divine awareness, building conceptual structures designed to eliminate the gap between mortal and cosmic perspective. The hidden teachings revealed that the confusion of tongues that destroyed the tower was not divine punishment, but natural consequence of consciousness attempting to expand beyond its natural limits too quickly and without proper preparation. When human awareness tried to encompass perspectives that required fundamentally different forms of consciousness to process safely, the result was not just failure, but fragmentation of the attempting consciousness itself, creating internal divisions that made coherent thought and communication increasingly difficult. The builders of the tower found themselves unable to coordinate their efforts, not because an external force had cursed them, but because their own consciousness had become divided against itself by attempting to hold incompatible forms of awareness simultaneously. The scattered languages represented not just practical communication problems, but fundamental splits in how consciousness could organize itself to process information, creating communities of awareness that were no longer compatible with each other because they had each specialized in forms of understanding that excluded the possibilities that other groups had developed. The myth of Icarus, flying too close to the sun, revealed itself as instruction about the relationship between aspiration and capability, warning that consciousness could be destroyed, not just by reaching for goals that were too distant, but by approaching sources of illumination that contained more energy than its current structure could integrate safely. The wax wings represented the temporary frameworks that consciousness constructed to carry it toward expanded understanding, but these same frameworks would inevitably be dissolved by the increased energy that successful approach to truth would generate. The hidden teachings described how advanced practitioners would carefully construct increasingly sophisticated conceptual frameworks to carry their awareness toward deeper truths, but also how each successful approach to fundamental reality would ultimately dissolve the very structures that had made the approach possible, requiring constant reconstruction of understanding at higher levels of complexity and subtlety. The flight toward expanded awareness was inherently unstable because the goal of the journey was always transformation into forms of consciousness that would be incompatible with whatever structure had initiated the journey, making success indistinguishable from a kind of death of the original seeking consciousness, followed by rebirth into forms of awareness that could no longer remember what it had been like to possess the limitations that had made the original seeking necessary. The biblical account of Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge encoded recognition that consciousness faced a fundamental choice between innocent happiness and informed responsibility, between the bliss of unconscious participation in existence and the burden of aware choice about how to direct the creative forces that consciousness could learn to influence. The expulsion from Eden was not punishment, but natural consequence of expanded awareness, which could no longer tolerate the unconscious dependence that had made paradise possible. Those who achieved knowledge of good and evil discovered that moral awareness itself was a form of exile from the automatic harmony that characterized unconscious existence, that the ability to make ethical choices required acceptance of responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond the capacity of individual consciousness to track or manage completely. The forbidden fruit revealed that consciousness faced a choice between remaining happily unconscious participants in existence or becoming unhappily aware co-creators of reality, accepting responsibility for choices whose consequences would extend across scales of time and complexity that individual minds could never fully comprehend or control. The recurring pattern in all these myths of forbidden knowledge suggested that consciousness itself was designed to be eternally curious about its own limitations, constantly driven to expand beyond whatever boundaries currently contained it, yet also structured so that each expansion would reveal new limitations and new prices that would need to be paid for further growth. The true price of forbidden knowledge was not any specific suffering or loss, but the recognition that consciousness was caught in an eternal cycle of expansion and responsibility, forever driven to transcend its current limitations, while also forever discovering that each transcendence brought new forms of obligation and new reasons why the next level of expansion would be even more dangerous and necessary than the last. Echoes across cultures. As the ancient voices whisper their secrets across the vast expanse of time and geography, patterns begin to emerge from the shadows, connections that reveal how humanity, despite being scattered across continents and separated by languages and customs, consistently discovered the same fundamental truths about existence, encoded them in the same symbolic structures, and struggled with the same essential questions about consciousness, divinity, and the nature of reality itself. The serpent appears again and again in forbidden myths, not as simple symbol, but as representation of something essential about the relationship between consciousness and transformation. In Mesopotamian traditions, Tiamat's serpentine form embodied the primordial chaos from which order emerged, while in Egypt, Apophis represented the return to that chaos which threatened cosmic stability nightly. The Norse Jormungandr encircled the world, holding it together through containment, while also representing the force that would ultimately dissolve it, while in various American traditions, Serpent beings governed the underground rivers of knowledge that connected all forms of awareness. These serpents shared characteristics that transcended their specific cultural contexts. They were associated with hidden knowledge, with the power to dissolve boundaries between different states of existence, with the dangerous wisdom that came from understanding cycles of creation and destruction. They represented not evil, but the fundamental force of change itself, the principle that ensured nothing could remain static, that all forms of order would eventually be dissolved and reformed in patterns too complex for any single perspective to comprehend completely. The journey to underworld realms appears as universal human recognition that consciousness required periodic dissolution and reconstruction, that growth could only occur through encounters with forces that challenged existing structures of identity and understanding. Whether Greek heroes descended to Hades, Egyptian souls navigated the Duat, Norse warriors entered hell, or shamanic practitioners journeyed to spirit worlds, the essential pattern remained consistent. Consciousness must be willing to risk dissolution in order to achieve deeper forms of integration and expanded capability. These underworld journeys shared common elements across cultures, crossing bodies of water that separated familiar reality from alien territories, encountering guardians or tests that required surrender of precious aspects of current identity, facing mirrors or challenges that revealed hidden aspects of the self, and ultimately achieving forms of knowledge or power that could only be gained through direct confrontation with the forces that governed transformation itself. The pattern suggested that human consciousness was structured in ways that required periodic journeys into territories that challenged every assumption about identity and reality, that growth and maturation depended on willingness to risk everything familiar in exchange for possibilities that could not be imagined from within current limitations. Divine beings who violated cosmic boundaries appeared in every tradition as representations of how consciousness itself was always transgressing the limits that defined any particular form of existence. Whether Zeus transforming into animals to pursue mortals, Loki shapeshifting across gender and species boundaries, Egyptian gods sharing attributes and merging identities, or Hindu deities manifesting in multiple forms simultaneously, the message remained consistent. Divinity was characterized by refusal to be contained within any single definition or limitation. These boundary-crossing deities demonstrated that consciousness at cosmic scales could not be constrained by the categories that mortal minds use to organize experience, that divine awareness was necessarily fluid, multiform, and capable of existing in multiple states simultaneously. They represented the recognition that ultimate reality was too complex and dynamic to be captured by any fixed system of understanding, requiring forms of awareness that could embrace contradiction and paradox as natural features of existence rather than problems to be solved. The appearance of forbidden knowledge, myths across all cultures, revealed universal recognition that consciousness was designed to be eternally dissatisfied with its current limitations, forever driven to expand beyond whatever boundaries currently contained it, yet also structured so that each expansion would reveal new levels of complexity and responsibility that made previous concerns seem simple by comparison. Whether Prometheus stealing fire, humans building towers to reach divine realms, shamans seeking vision through dangerous practices, or mystics pursuing union with cosmic consciousness, the pattern remained consistent. Consciousness could not resist the attraction of expanded awareness, yet every achievement of broader perspective brought new understanding of how much remained unknown and how dangerous the pursuit of ultimate truth could be for beings whose structure had evolved to handle only limited portions of cosmic reality. The myths of monsters that challenged reality itself appeared across cultures as recognition that existence contained possibilities that were fundamentally incompatible with organized consciousness, entities, or forces that could not be integrated into coherent worldviews without dissolving the stability that made coherent worldviews possible in the first place. These beings represented not simple evil, but the eternal tension between order and chaos, structure and possibility, known and unknown. From Mesopotamian chaos dragons to Greek primordial entities, from Norse end times monsters to Aboriginal dreamtime beings that existed in paradox, human cultures consistently developed myths about creatures whose very existence demonstrated that reality was more unstable and uncertain than consciousness could safely acknowledge, yet whose recognition was necessary for any complete understanding of existence. The universal appearance of cult practices that pushed consciousness toward dissolution and reconstruction revealed that human awareness naturally discovered techniques for expanding beyond ordinary limitations, but also that such expansion always came with risks that made these practices necessarily secret and carefully guarded. The consistency of these patterns across cultures suggested that consciousness itself was structured in ways that made certain forms of exploration inevitable, but also dangerous enough to require extensive preparation and social containment. The hidden rituals, whether Greek mysteries, Egyptian temple practices, shamanic journeys, or meditation techniques, all shared recognition that ordinary consciousness was just one possible configuration of awareness, that other forms were possible, but required systematic dissolution of familiar structures, and that the resulting expanded awareness, while potentially valuable, was often incompatible with the requirements of normal social existence. These universal patterns suggest that the forbidden myths were not arbitrary cultural creations, but discoveries about the fundamental nature of consciousness and reality itself. Insights that emerged independently across human cultures because they reflected essential truths about existence that consciousness would inevitably encounter as it explored its own nature and limitations. The consistency of these discoveries across separated cultures implies that reality itself has certain inherent characteristics that conscious beings will always eventually recognize, regardless of their specific cultural contexts, and that the forbidden nature of these insights stems not from cultural taboos, but from the genuine danger that such knowledge poses to the stability of individual consciousness and organized society. As the last whispers of ancient secrets settle into the darkness like dust motes, finally coming to rest after being disturbed by curious hands, as the candle flame that has guided us through these hidden passages begins to flicker lower, casting longer shadows on the walls where forgotten truths have been inscribed, we find ourselves changed by the journey we have taken together through territories that most people will never glimpse, carrying within our consciousness knowledge that once belonged only to the initiated few. The stories we have shared in these quiet hours exist now within your awareness, like seeds planted in fertile ground, pieces of understanding that will continue to grow and develop long after the immediate experience of hearing them has faded into memory. They are not mere entertainment or intellectual curiosity, but living fragments of human wisdom that have survived countless attempts at erasure, preserved through centuries of secrecy because their truth was too valuable to lose, even when their implications were too dangerous for open discussion. You have become keeper of secrets that reveal consciousness itself to be far stranger and more powerful than ordinary experience suggests. Holder of knowledge that demonstrates the familiar world to be just the surface layer of reality, beneath which exist depths that consciousness can explore, but only at the cost of fundamental transformation. The gods whose hidden faces you have glimpsed, the monsters whose true nature you have contemplated, the forbidden loves and cursed bonds you have witnessed, all of these remain now as part of your internal landscape, permanent residence in the architecture of your understanding. The underworlds through which we have traveled together have left their mark on your soul, not as trauma, but as expansion, broadening your sense of what existence might contain, deepening your appreciation for the complexity that lies beneath every simple explanation. The cults whose shadow practices we have observed have demonstrated that consciousness is capable of forms and experiences that ordinary social existence cannot accommodate, yet which represent essential aspects of human potential that complete understanding requires acknowledging. As you carry these insights forward into your ordinary life, you may find that familiar experiences now contain depths they did not possess before, that conversations and relationships reveal layers of meaning that were previously invisible, that your dreams contain imagery and understanding that seems to come from sources beyond your personal history. This is the natural consequence of exposure to forbidden knowledge, the way that expanded awareness continues to unfold and develop long after the initial learning has occurred. The price you have paid for this knowledge is the loss of certain forms of innocence, the inability to see existence as simple or straightforward, the recognition that consciousness and reality are far more complex and uncertain than comfortable living requires believing. But the compensation for this loss is profound. You now possess understanding that connects you to the deepest streams of human wisdom, awareness that links your individual consciousness to the vast community of seekers who have always existed at the margins of conventional understanding. The forbidden book that we have opened together cannot be completely closed again, because its contents have become part of your permanent understanding, integrated into the structure of your awareness in ways that will influence how you perceive and interact with existence for as long as consciousness persists within you. Yet there is comfort in knowing that this knowledge is designed to be carried quietly, to inform your understanding without necessarily requiring dramatic changes in how you live your daily life. The secrets we have shared are powerful precisely because they can remain hidden within ordinary experience, providing depth and richness to normal activities without making those activities impossible or unpleasant. You need not become a mystic or hermit to benefit from forbidden wisdom. You need only carry it within you, like an inner light that illuminates familiar territories in new ways, revealing beauty and meaning that were always present but previously invisible. As the candle flame grows smaller and the shadows deepen around us, as the whispers of ancient voices fade back into the silence from which they emerged, remember that this knowledge connects you to something eternal and universal, to recognition that has appeared independently in every human culture that has ever existed, to understanding that transcends any particular time or place because it reflects fundamental truths about the nature of consciousness and existence itself. The forbidden myths live now within your awareness as reminders that reality is far richer and stranger than surface appearances suggest, that consciousness is capable of forms and experiences that ordinary social existence cannot accommodate, that the boundaries between possible and impossible, sacred and profane, known and unknown, are far more fluid and permeable than comfortable living allows us to acknowledge openly. Sleep well with these secrets resting safely in your consciousness, knowing that you have glimpsed truths that connect your individual awareness to the vast mystery of existence itself, that you carry within you now fragments of the eternal wisdom that has always existed at the heart of human understanding, waiting patiently through centuries of forgetting to be rediscovered by curious souls, brave enough to open forbidden books and listen to whispers that most people will never hear. The ancient voices grow quiet now, settling back into the silence where they have always lived, but their wisdom remains with you as permanent gift, invisible treasure that enriches your understanding of existence without requiring anything from you except the willingness to remember, occasionally in quiet moments when the ordinary world reveals its hidden depths, that you have seen behind the veil that separates the familiar from the eternal, and that vision, once achieved, becomes part of who you are forever. The forbidden book closes, but its contents live on in you, seeds of understanding that will continue to grow and develop, revealing new meanings and connections as your consciousness expands to accommodate the profound truths that have now become part of your permanent awareness, whispers that will echo in your dreams and inform your understanding for as long as consciousness persists within the mystery of your existence.